All right, Don, thanks for joining me again for a conversation about your experiences related to social entrepreneurship. Really appreciate you doing this. We're going upside down for a minute. There's Jessica hooking up the power. um, we're going to pick up the thread here.
You're gonna write that up again? No.
Oh, you want it to be the other way?
Yeah.
That went that way.
There we go. All right. We're gonna pick up the thread here with what occurred in the latter half of the 1970s, with you beginning to receive communications from folks in Arizona who wanted you to come out and get involved with their efforts to improve the conditions for seasonal workers working in in Arizona agriculture. These were Mexican nationals working in Arizona seasonally and then going back to Mexico. They were not trying to stay in the United States, as I recall. So I wanted to start out with asking you, how did this all come about? Why did they reach out to you? How did this all begin?
Well, actually, I was asked in the beginning of 1977 by a fellow named Lupe Sanchez, who was a former organizer for Cesar Chavez and the UFW in Arizona, if I would come and help them regroup in Arizona. The UFW had withdrawn from Arizona in the early 1970s in a dispute with state government. Jack Williams, when he was governor of Arizona, had worked with the legislature to pass a very difficult piece of legislation for organizing. The Arizona State Farm Labor Act of some sort, it was called, which made virtually every aspect of organizing illegal in the farm organizing business. To boycott was a felony, for God's sake. You couldn't work effectively. And I had met Lupe in the context of working on a journalism project after the murder of Don Bowles in Phoenix. And I had come over from Santa Fe to work on that project. And we did one article on a ranch called Arrowhead Ranch, where workers are being badly treated by the owners. And I met Lupe in that context. He helped us with that story. And it's kind of quid pro quo. He asked me if I would come over from Santa Fe and work with them for a year to get back on the ground with an organizing effort. He kind of got his juices flowing again, working with us on the journalism project. And I said, sure. It was a challenge. It was really kind of interesting if one could, in the face of that farm labor law, find a way through and make organizing work. And I should note, we were not just looking at undocumented workers. We were looking at local workers as well.
Okay.
Local Mexican American, Black, and Anglo migrant workers as well.
Let me stop you there. I got a couple questions. First off,
sure.
So for those who watch this video, I will put in the comment section a link to a documentary that's now available through Amazon about the investigation of the assassination of Arizona Republic reporter Don Bowles, who was killed by a car bomb placed under his car in 1976. And a lot of journalists came down to Arizona, something called the Arizona Project, sponsored by investigative reporters and editors, to try to expose corruption in Arizona and sort of push back against organized crime or whoever had killed one of their own. And that'll be in the description. It's another silo of your life, which we're not going to be talking about in this series. But what I want to know is, why did Lupe Sanchez conclude that you would be a good community organizer? What did you convey to him about that?
We had a good mutual friend, Gustavo Gutierrez, who's now deceased, who had also been a key part of the former UFW organizing efforts in Arizona. He was a friend of Cesar personally. When Cesar did his great fast in the early 70s in Arizona, he did it in Gustavo Gutierrez's house, as a matter of fact, with Gustavo's wife as a nurse, making sure he was okay. And I had known Gustavo through other people. So Lupe learned a little bit about my organizing background in Santa Fe through Gus, I think. And Gus had given him some reason to think that I was an effective organizer and might be able to help him get things on the ground. The problem that Lupe had was not in organizing skill. The problem he had was in the bureaucratic end of it, how to set up a business, a corporation, an organizing project, how to fund it, how to get it legal, how to raise money for it, how to keep the books. He was not an administrative kind of guy. He was an in the field organizing kind of guy, and he somehow had come to believe that I could fulfill the other elements of that need, and asked me if I would help them do so.
So I'm going to stop
And
there and
that-
just say that in the previous video in this series, we talked about how you helped to stand up the heroin addiction clinic in Santa Fe. So that was an example of that type of work, right? How to fund it, how to organize it, how to navigate the bureaucracy.
I could write proposals and raise money. Basically, I could get things done. I could run an office. I could get things on the boards, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, sure, I'll take a look at it initially. And I read the state farm labor law, and the growers, in their enthusiasm to punish a union, had made the mistake of making the anti-union law so specifically anti-union that it had a great glaring weakness. It did not stop anybody who wasn't a union from organizing. And my assumption was that we could come in as a nonprofit civil rights group and create enough havoc on the ground for the growers that at some point they themselves would ask for stability. And that means a contract, and that means a union. We could get around the law by basically just making life so miserable for them that they would want to do something about it that was permanent. But the law was not set up in such a way that it could do any damage to a nonprofit civil rights organization. We were not collecting dues. We were not having memberships. We did not formally represent them in bargaining sessions. We were a civil rights group that came in looking at civil rights violations in the field and raising hell about them, with help, of course, from the workers. So we set up something called the Maricopa County Organizing Project, otherwise known as MCOP, in 1977. And Lupe began, I got money for it almost immediately, and initially for Lupe at the beginning of that year. And he began actually organizing in Mexico. And we picked Arrowhead Ranch, which was the Goldwater Martori Ranch, as our principal initial target. It was the most powerful ranch in the state because of the Goldwater family connection. And we figured if we could take them on and prevail, we could send a message we could take on anybody and prevail, which I'm sure was not true, but that was the naivete we were thinking at the time. And so Lupe began organizing workers in Mexico that summer who were going to be coming to that ranch in the fall. He knew where they lived in Mexico, what villages and what towns, what states the workers largely came from for that ranch. So he did a lot of pre-organizing with monies I had raised in Mexico in that summer period. And with the message is, if you really need the job when you come up here to work and pick fruit, go someplace else. But if you want to do some good for the farm labor movement and you're willing to go on strike and to do something about it, come to Arrowhead Ranch.
Let me stop you there. Let me just stop you there. So Arrowhead Ranch was growing lemons, right?
Lemons, oranges, grapefruit, everything.
Citrus. They were growing citrus, and this is work in the trees. And I think it's important to note that one of the reasons why there were Mexican nationals doing this work on a seasonal basis was it was so arduous, such difficult work, that there weren't that many people in the United States, Americans in the United States, were willing to do that work, right? It was a very difficult thing to hire Americans to do that job because it was so arduous.
Well, that turned out to be very much the case. We thought it was initially just a function of money. We thought that at some point when the wage structure got a hell of a lot better, the local workers might be inclined to do the job, but that ultimately didn't pan out. We didn't see local workers moving in no matter how good the wages got, which surprised us a little bit. It's hard work, working in the trees with thorns, and you're going up in a tree and you're picking fast. You're picking ultimately on a piece rate basis. Even under a labor contract, when we got a contract, we had a minimum wage floor, which was better than the federal minimum wage. And then we had a piece rate system that the workers actually liked better because they could make a lot more money with it.
They were very good. They were very good pickers. But let me just back up and ask one other thing, which is describe the living conditions that you encountered at the beginning of this process for these workers.
There was no housing at all. They were simply living under the trees in the orchards, living in little cardboard boxes that they built for themselves. No clean water. They were drinking ditch water. They had agricultural chemicals and fertilizers and God knows what in it. And they had no health care. They had no meal other than making tortillas and whatever they could do for themselves with little fires they could build out in the orchard. No health care, nothing. I mean, it was really abysmal. They're being paid about $10 a day, which was a violation of minimum wage, and often being robbed of some of that by thieves and all kinds of stuff. It was a really a terrible situation. As a result of which, they also was very high turnover. The Arrowhead Ranch probably employed between 200 and 300 people at a time, but over the course of a season, they might have 2,000 or 3,000 people going through there, because they often wouldn't stay very long. The conditions were so terrible, and it was not any worse than any of the other citrus farms at that time. It was just typical. And I might give you one of the pieces of explanation. Well, we had a weird situation in Arizona, which I had not thought about ahead of time. We had lots and lots of citizen workers, local Mexican Americans, blacks, Anglos, all kinds of people working in the crops like green onions and stuff that were low to the ground, where they were visible as people. And the orchards, undocumented workers could hide. They weren't being seen from the road. So they were less visible to the public. And so we had a situation develop where undocumented workers basically ended up in the citrus groves, and citizen workers ended up harvesting, green onions and truck farming kinds of stuff where they could be visibly seen by Border Patrol and everybody else. That was where the thing separated itself at that time. But it was really an abysmal living situation. But they had no way to stop us from organizing. We weren't doing anything that they could come after us for as a union to make it difficult to function, which drove them, I'm sure, slightly nutty, trying to figure out how to deal with it. But they just had not anticipated a civil rights approach to the problem, and so we exercised it to the max. We first struck Arrowhead Ranch as MCOP, as a civil rights organization, over such simple violations as give the guys notice when you're going to spray the fields or the orchards so they can get their stuff out of the way. So they were spraying people's belongings and their groceries and everything else when they spraying the workers when they sprayed. And just a simple thing, let them know when you're coming so they can get out of the way and get their stuff out of the way. Didn't cost to grow or anything, just common courtesy. A lot of things like that in the initial issues we raised. Anyway, we shut the thing down on the 3rd of October, 1977. I remember the date quite clearly. Caught the owners of the operation completely unaware we were doing it. Art Martori, the general manager of the place, was on a plane to Tokyo when we shut his place down, marketing his fruit in Asia. And we shut the damn thing down. And the strike lasted 22 days. We had about 300 people on strike. It became the largest organized institutional hide and seek I have ever seen in my life. The Border Patrol came out in mass, offended that these guys had the balls to strike undocumented workers and embarrass them. So they were there in mass with helicopters and trucks and vans and lots of people. It was about a 6,000-acre orchard, a lot of trees, a lot of places to run to and hide in. And but they were gradually catching people. We probably lost 100 or so people in the course of that 22 days. But a bulk of the workers hung in there and managed to evade capture. And some of the ones that were captured and sent back to Mexico were already back and having joined the strike a second time when the strike ended. We didn't know whether we were winning or losing, but we got a massive amount of publicity, which we had anticipated because it was a Goldwater partly owned operation. And that drew a tremendous amount of press attention in the Phoenix area in television and print media. And that media impact probably had almost more impact than we did as a strike. It embarrassed the hell out of the Goldwater family and the Martori family when TV cameras came out there and put on full public view the working conditions that those people were living in. I mean, people treated cattle better than they treated workers at that time. Cattle had barns, had clean water to drink many times. These guys had nothing. And the public pressure mounted and mounted and mounted, and the Goldwater family got really tired of it. And they finally told the Martoris apparently to settle the damn thing. And on the 22nd of October of 77, the white flag appeared, and we in effect won that action.
Let me stop you there. I want to stop you there, and I want to ask you what you personally were doing during that time period. What was your daily involvement?
Well, when the strike began, I was back and forth between Santa Fe and Phoenix. I was in the process of moving. And so a lot of my initial contact with the Phoenix press as the sort of press secretary, if you will, for the strike, because that was the other thing that they expected me to be able to do as a journalist, mobilize the media, which was what I was doing. I mean, Lupe was running the operation on the ground, and Devereux was the one calling the press and getting the attention. But I did some of that from Santa Fe. I was actually calling the Arizona Republic those first couple of days when the strike started from my home in Santa Fe. I was in touch with Lupe by phone, and I would call the press in Santa Fe by phone and tell them what was happening and where to go. And in the process of moving over. And before the strike was over, I was in the Phoenix area with my family at the time, you know, getting settled in for that. But I was back and forth, and it was complicated getting all that done. We didn't know whether we were winning or losing in a typical situation like that. Almost every time we thought we knew what was happening, we were wrong. And we had no indication at this point whether we were winning or losing the strike. So we were pleasantly surprised when Art Martori waved the flag on the 22nd of October and settled it. That labor action has become famous in Mexico. There are corridos written about it, songs. It was one of those first times that undocumented workers had ever stood up. And it was the first in the American labor movement. It was the first time that ever been a massive labor action. I don't mean just a few people, I mean hundreds of people, every one of which was illegal at the time he went on strike. That was never done before effectively in this country, and people thought it couldn't be done. They just couldn't have that happen because of their vulnerability as undocumented folks. We proved it could be, and it worked. But that was the first that ever happened.
One other question. So most of these workers coming up for seasonal labor in Arizona, where in Mexico were they coming from?
Guanajuato, Querétaro, places like that, mostly central Mexico, not so much near the border, but from quite a ways south into Mexico.
As I recall, those two states are sort of northeast of Mexico City.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And we got whole villages came, and so you had a kind of situation where the people that came to a particular ranch often came from roughly the same part of Mexico. They came up together as large groups, and they often worked in the same places together. So you had whole villages of people from Guanajuato and Querétaro at Arrowhead Ranch. All guys knew each other on both sides of the border, knew each other quite well, often relatives of each other even. And Lupe had, you know, he had known that sociology very well, which allowed him, because he was from Mexico originally himself. Lupe was from that part of the world. He was able to identify where they came from and organize them before they got there. That was the biggest piece of success we were able to muster. Was that we didn't have to go in after the fact and do it. We did some clever things also. That summer, we arranged to hide a lot of groceries in green garbage bags in the trees on that ranch, which meant that even when the strike was going on and they didn't have access ostensibly to food, they had food in green garbage bags stashed away in some of the trees on the ranch, out of which they could survive, make tortillas and stuff while they were running from the Border Patrol.
You realize, don't you? This is like military logistics, is what you're describing here. It's like you have to place your assets.
Yeah.
Let me ask one other thing.
We sent people in at night that summer
Sure.
to load the trees with garbage bags, which never got caught by the ranch. They never noticed the fact that their trees were bearing a different kind of fruit than they might have. We had planned the thing as carefully as we could plan it, not sure how the hell it was going to work out, and it worked out even better in many respects than we could have anticipated. And we got a lot of organizing experience out of it too. We had, other than Lupe and Gustavo Gutierrez, who was involved as old UFW guys, most of the people we had were younger, without a whole lot of experience, and they learned. We went through a kind of organizing 101 with these kids in that process of getting it done, and everybody became very skilled very quickly. We had a house, we called it the Vista House in El Mirage, Arizona, which is a suburb west of Phoenix, which we housed these kids in. We paid them Vista scale, $265 a month and $75 gas allowance. Everybody got that, even Lupe. Nobody made more than that. We paid them Vista scale. And we even used illegally, I'm happy to say, Vistas. My wife at the time went to San Francisco, Naomi, and went through a Vista training program to become a Vista supervisor. And we then, without the government's knowledge, had a crew of Vistas working under Naomi who effectively were working for us. And the same scale that we were paying everybody else. So several of our organizers were actually being paid by Vista, which I'm sure would not be appreciated by the growers if they had known that at the time, but that was the truth. We didn't mind bending the rules a little bit. And so we had Vistas working for us, and a lot of young lawyers. We needed lawyers for all kinds of obvious reasons, because we had to defend guys that were busted. We had to be able to deal with any efforts to enjoin us, which were many that the growers made to try to stop us from doing what we were doing, try to stop us from picketing or anything else that they could think of. So we needed a lot of legal work. And we had one instance that I am particularly proud of. I can't remember whether it was at Arrowhead Ranch or another one. It was one of the ranches we were striking at that general time. To increase the number of people able to chase workers around, the decision was made by the Border Patrol to bring in the Sheriff's Department and to use them as adjuncts for the Border Patrol. At that time, for the Sheriff's Department to get involved, there had to be a local issue that they could be, because immigration was not an issue for the Border Patrol. The workers just being illegal.
The sheriff couldn't deal with immigration, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they had to find an issue, and the issue was trespass. They got looking at sheriffs out of a Dodge commercial with sunglasses and dogs, and looking nasty. We went to court, federal court, with a group of young attorneys, not knowing what the hell we were going to do. We happened to draw a guy named Carl Bickey in the federal court. Good guy, good judge, by just chance when we appeared seeking a temporary restraining order against the Sheriff's Department. And we didn't know what we were going to argue. And one young lawyer stepped up immediately to the bench and said, "Your Honor, if all the grower is giving these guys to live in is trees, those are their homes," he said, "a man's tree becomes his castle, and he cannot be evicted from his castle by trespass orders. He has to be evicted by an eviction notice. You can't just go out there and bust him for trespass. You've got to post a notice on his tree, evicting him from that tree. It gives him 30 days to get the hell out of there." And so we expect the Sheriff's Department to come out and begin tacking up, eviction notices on all the trees under which they think the worker is living. And that will give us a month then to deal with that issue. The growers were so blown out by this "a man's tree is his castle" argument that they didn't have anything to offer. They looked at the judge sort of stunned. And the judge said, "So rules." And on that basis, we got the Sheriff's Department off the property with their dogs. They never did go out, obviously, and try to tack up eviction notices.
Be a lot of eviction notices. And let me ask you one other question here at this point. I know, just to jump into a little bit ahead. I know at a certain point, recognizing that there were economic development issues in those two Mexican states from which these workers were coming, you all had an eye on trying to fix some of those development issues down in Mexico. How early on did you have an eye on doing that?
We thought about it, but we didn't actually do anything about it until we got our first labor contract. Our first labor contract after 10 shutdowns at Arrowhead Ranch, from the fall of 77 to January of 79, we shut it down maybe 10 times over various issues as MCOP. In January of 79, Art Martori said, "This is getting ridiculous. I don't want to have a one month deal with you guys where you shut me down again in 30 days. What can we do to make this a longer term deal?" And we said, "That's a labor contract, Art." And he agreed. And on that basis, we signed a 2-year contract with him and became a union. But we became a union when he was ready for one. At that point, we were ready to do something about the issue you just raised. Not for necessarily the humanitarian reasons you're thinking. We were a little more mundane about it. Our concern was as we began to get wages up, we were going to see citizens beginning to want to work those jobs. And as that began to happen, we thought these guys aren't going to have work. The Mexican American guys, the Mexican national guys are going to be out of work. So we, in our initial labor contract with Martori, we built in a clause in the contract that said every worker, on top of the salary he gets under the labor contract, piece rate or hourly, you set aside 10 cents per hour per worker in a special fund you'll give us every month, which will go into a foundation which we set up called the Farm Worker Economic Development Corporation. And we were going to use that money we got from the growers, the 10 cents per hour, the extra money, as matching funds to go to foundations and leverage additional monies for the foundation, and use that collectively to begin to finance economic development projects in the villages from which these guys came from. So as they began to lose their jobs up here, they could begin to have jobs where they came from in Mexico. And we set up something called the Cooperativa Sin Fronteras in Mexico, based in Querétaro, the city of Querétaro, to actually run these development fund projects in the Mexican side of the border. And that ultimately, before we were done, swelled to 20 cents per hour per worker under subsequent contracts, which also could be done in kind. We would take from a grower a truck, a water drilling rig, equipment, and work out a fair value, and he could give us that in lieu of 10 cents or 20 cents per hour per worker. We moved a certain amount of vehicles and equipment into Mexico as part of that arrangement. But it was all being done initially because we thought these guys were going to lose their jobs. As it worked out, we were wrong. We got to the point that some of the workers rather quickly at Arrowhead Ranch were making something like $110 a week picking grapefruits, for example, which in those days was, $110 a day, not a week, $110 a day. From they're making less than $10 a day before, now they're making 110. It's a lot of money even in those days for anybody, $110 a day. Even at that level, we did not see any serious influx by citizen workers. A few tried and never lasted very long.
No, it's extremely hard. I have to say that I've grown 2 different forms of citrus indoors here in Maryland. And the first thing you notice about these things is they have thorns. Yeah, you don't expect that, but all citrus has thorns, and it's really, you can really ding yourself even on a little citrus plant.
Right.
It's tough.
And the other thing I noticed about the Mexican workers especially was they had good politics. They made their money on a piece rate system. You run up the thing with a big bag, you fill it up, you bring it back, you dump the bag into a large, like a dumpster that the growers provided to dump these bags in. And there's a foreman there who's keeping track of every bag you dump and give you the credit for that bag on your particular tally sheet. What the workers did at Arrowhead Ranch in particular is they decided that they weren't going to do that system. They were going to give everybody the same. So rather than keep track of each individual, they simply kept track of the crew. And everybody got the same amount of money, whether he picked 1 or 2 more bags than somebody else did. They were all pretty good at it, but their own solidarity was better served if they were all getting paid the same amount of money.
Sure, it's like splitting tips at a restaurant.
That was their choice. They kept good solidarity by not having anybody doing any better than anybody else, and they all did pretty well.
And they did something else.
If somebody was sick, they would also carry him that day. If he couldn't go out and work that day, he was back, recovering from the flu or something.
Sure,
he got his share. They were very, very good about sharing the wealth, if you will.
And they did something else. They did something else you told me, which is at a certain point, they voted at a certain point to split the season. They were making so much money that they, on their own, said a group of workers will come up for part of the season, then go back, and another group of workers will replace us because we're making plenty of money, and we're better off if we do that.
They did some of that. I mean, some of the guys stayed all year. Some of them accepted the fact that they had relatives or other people come up and work for a few months and do well. We had a mixture of those things going on. But even the guys that came up as second tier guys were very skilled. We had a seniority system at Arrowhead Ranch and the other ranches. And Art Martori called it the Super Bowl of citrus. I mean, he had probably the best citrus harvesters on the planet working under his labor contract. Even the guys coming up as second tier, they were all very good at what they were doing. They've been doing it for a long time, and they were quite skilled. And one of the ways that Art made money, and he made money doing this system, he built housing for them. He gave them decent wages. He gave them health care. He gave them clean water to drink. He did all the things we wanted him to do, under the contract without any trouble. And he still made money, which was his gamble. He had thought about this whole thing very carefully. I learned in later conversations with him, and figured out if he could increase the production per worker by upwards of 30%, he could make it work on our terms and still make money as a rancher. We'd all do well. It was a gamble on his part that if he had a much reduced workforce that was stable and motivated, that he could actually make this work for us and bring the whole business into the 20th century and not make it a shame like it was before. So it could be done.
Let me stop you there. Let me stop you there and just point out once again, we see the reaching for the win-win scenario, right? Now we're gonna run out of time. I want to pivot to something else here.
Sure.
Just briefly, just say a few words, if you would, about moving out into the green onions, moving the unions work out into the fields where it was often Americans working.
Yeah, there were 9 green onion farms in Maricopa County at that time, all pretty sizable. We didn't have the capacity to shut them all down and handle a strike fund for the striking workers. So we thought we would do a rolling strike, where we'd strike one farm at a time. This is all happening while the Arrowhead Ranch strike is going on at the same time. We thought we would strike one onion farm at a time and simply move those workers into the other farms and pick off one farm at a time in a labor action. And we completely underestimated our capacity to keep the workers under control and overestimated our capacity to control the situation. And within a day or so of having started the first strike, all 9 farms struck. There was so much anger at the situation, we could not contain it. Everybody went out. And we suddenly had all 9 green onion farms on strike, with no strike fund to support anybody, but expecting us somehow to carry the day. And this is several thousand people plus families. So we're probably looking at 5,000 or 10,000 folks we got to sustain. And all I can remember was my days of admiring Dorothy Day in Chicago and the soup kitchen operation she ran there with volunteers. And so that's what we did. We mobilized student groups, machas on campus, churches, all kinds of people in the metropolitan Phoenix area as volunteers. And we began a massive ongoing food drive. Surplus stuff from restaurants, dented cans from grocery stores, day-old bread from bakeries, everything we could get our hands on daily. I mean, every day. Massive amounts of food began to flow into El Mirage. We set up a service center to handle this stuff, like a food bank. And out of that, we fed all these people. We had food camps, food distributing kitchens out in the field at a couple of strike camps. And we had a kitchen in El Mirage where we could feed people. And we managed to feed somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people from October until January of 78,
Mm-hmm.
with no budget at all. I mean, no budget, zip. It was exhausting. We were getting, crazy from the lack of sleep, everybody, all the vistas and the non-vistas and everybody else doing this stuff. Sometimes we'd have staff meetings and end up with 2 or 3 guys wrestling in the corner. They'd be so angry at each other over some damn thing. It was getting weird. It was just getting weird. It was just getting strange from lack of sleep. But we managed to pull it off. And that strike ultimately settled as a draw in January of 78. We weren't getting anywhere, and the growers weren't getting anywhere, and it was ultimately a draw. What we learned the hard way about that one was the need for better research than we had done at the outset. We did not know going in that almost all the green onions in America at that time came from these 9 farms in Maricopa County.
Wow.
This was the scallion capital of the planet. Despite the fact we had shut them down, they were using scabs. They were getting about a third of their crop out over that time. Meantime, the wholesale for green onions, because of the shortage, tripled. Do the
Right.
math.
Right.
The growers were coming out essentially the
Ahead.
same.
The same. Yeah, they were breaking even.
They were
Yeah.
breaking even, and we did not know that going in. Had we known that, it might have figured in somehow our capacity to handle it better than we did. But we had to learn that the hard way. I mean, I might stress here that a lot of us were virgins in the field of what we were looking at, and we're learning in the process of doing it the things we needed to know in the process of doing what we were doing. And so this is one of the lessons we learned. Learn more about the market, learn more about the pricing, learn more about the whole structure of the industry before you take on something like that, so you can do it with better intelligence than we did.
Let me move on to two things now. The first, so one of the outgrowths of the El Vicio clinic in Santa Fe was eventually standing up a community health center. I know because I, as a child, actually got some of my immunizations at that community health center in Santa Fe. You ended up standing up a community health center in El Mirage that I believe has now grown to be actually one of the largest HMOs in the state of Arizona.
It's a big rural HMO. We started as a storefront clinic on the main drag through El Mirage. Just a storefront we took over as a clinic and got a dock. It grew into eventually a larger standalone clinic Adelante in El Mirage, and evolved into something called Adelante Healthcare. It was Adelante Campesino when we had it. It's now Adelante Healthcare. It's become one of the larger HMOs in the state of Arizona. It's still functioning. A huge operation based out in Peoria, where its state headquarters is located. And it's survived and grown and become an immense rural healthcare operation at this point. But it began as a very small scale. I'm going to tell you how we started it.
Yeah, because I'm assuming that you perceived there was a definite need to provide health care to this population that was not being met by anybody else.
Before I talk about that, let me go back to what we set up in Santa Fe. You mentioned the primary clinic. Some of that happened before El Vicio got set up. First things we set up in Santa Fe were a primary healthcare thing called Clinica de la Gente in Santa Fe. We set up a community law center to provide legal services for poor people. And we set up a school called Tonancin, an alternative school. I had a mural project. El Vicio was one of a cluster of things that were organized at that time, all happening at about the same time. A whole bunch of stuff. It was a very energetic time in the barrio of Santa Fe, with a lot of organizing going on. Mm-hmm. The reason we organized, among other reasons, we organized a clinic in Arizona for the union was beyond the obvious need in the long run to have healthcare available. We had curiously an outbreak of gonorrhea early on in the organizing we did in the orchards. A coyote who was bringing some workers out there to the orchards had brought a couple of hookers out one night to service some of the workers, and we had an outbreak of gonorrhea in one of the labor camps. I'm talking 100 guys with a clap, and that's a problem. And we had to deal with that sort of piecemeal, get a doc here, a doc there, to get everybody sort of taken care of. But it was pretty obvious, whatever the problem might be, we're going to have our own medical capacities to resolve it. And that led very quickly to a decision that healthcare was one of the first items on our agenda as a labor operation. We needed to get our own docs and our own clinic and get it set up, and we did rather quickly. We brought some people in fact, from the clinic in Santa Fe, who had gone through the process there of setting one up to speed the process along in El Mirage, and borrowed a lot of that expertise from New Mexico to get the project going in Arizona.
How did you fund it in Arizona? How did you fund the startup?
National Health Service Corps and all the usual funding things that were available to fund clinics at that time. And the guys that we brought over from Santa Fe did the actual paperwork to get us those grants and get everything done. I had an advantage too. One of the docs that I had hired in Santa Fe, we had Matt Kelly and Fitzmullen, who were the two National Health Service Corps doctors that we had hired for the clinic in Santa Fe. Fitzmullen rose to become the head of the National Health Service Corps in Washington, ultimately.
Mhm.
So I had a really good connection in Washington with that funding source. And we were very able to get access to them through Fitz and get a grant for the clinic in El Mirage. Like everything else in those days, foundations or the government, it helps to have connections and have some experience dealing with particular people and particular foundation offices or agencies to get things done quickly. But we had that benefit. But we got a clinic set up very quickly and with good people, and it's a very important thing, both in Santa Fe and among the farm worker population of Arizona. That was one of the first, one of the top needs everybody felt, the workers felt that they needed to have, besides wages and the rest of it. The healthcare became right near the top of the list all the time, to have access to decent healthcare. So it was a credible issue to organize.
So I have two more. We're gonna coming soon on the end of our hour here. A couple of things. One of which I must note, you seem to have some sunshine shining on you pretty strongly there. Can you dim your window at all? Because it's blocking your face a little bit. If you want to take a second to do that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can try. I'm not sure what's going to happen here.
That's fine. If it's a problem, don't worry about it.
I'm not getting it done.
All right, sit down. That's fine. We'll live with it. Maybe if you
sit over
shift a
here,
little
is it better?
bit, there you go. If you shift a little bit out of the sunlight, we're good. Perfect. Second, so tell me in a nutshell, what was accomplished down in Mexico? What was the big picture of what you all accomplished down in Mexico with these funds that were put into this foundation? What did you achieve in those states these workers have been coming from?
Well, on a permanent basis, we developed farming equipment, farming co-ops. We put in drilling equipment to drill water wells in Guanajuato, especially. I remember we built an irrigation system in the mountains of Querétaro in the Sierra Madre. We built with concrete. There were springs up in the mountains of the Sierra. I think it's called the Sierra Gorda in Querétaro, actually, not Sierra Madre, Sierra Gorda. There are springs up in the mountains around those little villages like Ahuacatlan, and so there was water available. It just was sort of running loose from springs. And so we built reservoirs around 100 springs over a couple of years using local labor and concrete we bought with the money coming out of the 10 cents per hour per worker stuff and piping. And we built reservoirs, small reservoirs around 100 springs up in the mountains with piping running down to the villages for clean drinking water and irrigation water for them to farm with, to do terrace farming in that part of, on hillsides, because it was that kind of country, and brought in peach farming and all kinds of stuff to that area. But water in every area, whether it was in Guanajuato with wells or in Querétaro with springs and reservoirs and piping, water was the crucial thing we were working to develop to make available to those communities so they could have better agricultural stuff. We did a lot of that. I can't say we transformed Mexico, but we made a dent in the areas we were working in, at least. And that stuff has survived. I mean, those irrigation systems are still operative. We had a lot of trouble getting stuff across the border in Mexico.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, the bribery. Just moving equipment or anything else across. We never could persuade the Mexican people at the border that we were not taking the stuff down there and selling it. They thought everything that went in was being merchandised somehow, and they expected a piece of it. And they didn't understand nonprofits at all. They had no concept of that. So we ended up with a lot of bribe problems and settled them as best we could. It aggravated me to the point that I could not participate in those sessions.
Yeah, making you nuts.
I let Lupe and other people that were more accustomed to dealing with that deal with that. It just drove me crazy. But we get a lot of equipment down there. A lot of agricultural seed went down. So we got a lot of stuff in, a lot of supplies into Mexico with that money.
Where I'm going with this,
we were able to take the 10 and 20 cents per hour a worker. We got large grants from Ford Foundation, Inter-American Foundation, other big foundations to match the money we were raising. So we were probably spending like $1 million a year in Mexico in money or in kind.
Wow. The reason I'm raising this up is that in some sense you were right in the big picture, which is that the jobs were going to go away. You were wrong as to why the jobs were going to go away.
Yeah.
I want everybody to know, if you go to Arizona today, what was Arrowhead Ranch is now a large housing development.
Well, that happened in '86. It happened quicker than we thought. We were organizing, beginning in '76, '77. We knew it was eventually going to happen. But all the stuff we had organized in Western Maricopa County, all of a sudden in 1986, to stop being a farm. There was this sudden urban sprawl west from Phoenix that engulfed what is now Peoria and Glendale, Arizona. And all those farms were basically taken over for urban sprawl. And happily, under the Immigration Reform Act of that same period, Simpson-Rizzoli or whatever it was called, I can't remember, had a name. Many of our workers qualified for green cards under a special agricultural worker provision. If they could document they had been here for 3 agricultural seasons, they were entitled to get a green card for continued work in the States. And it didn't limit the kind of work they could do, and it opened a path to citizenship. And so most of our workers became legal with green cards at the time that all these farms were being obliterated. And many of them ended up working in golf course and construction work and all kinds of stuff in the new urban setting that they found themselves. Many of them ultimately stayed here and became citizens of the United States, which we had not anticipated.
Right.
The push to leave Mexico for the States was strong, despite the economic development stuff we were doing down there. America remained a very attractive destination for a lot of these people. And the other thing we accomplished, if you have time, was through the use of the 14th Amendment. We had to establish the fact, the hard way sometimes, that undocumented workers, before they became legal in '86 or whatever, had many legal rights which were not being recognized initially in Arizona. Under the 14th Amendment, which reads any person, not any citizen, anybody in this country essentially has the legal right to everything but jury duty and voting. And everything else is pretty accessible. And we had to enforce that with hospitals and other places where people were being turned away by bringing lawsuits sometimes to make sure that that didn't happen again. It took a lot of legal work to use the 14th Amendment to establish the fact that undocumented people had many, many rights in this country.
Sure. No, and we may pick that up again in the thread in our next conversation. Well, listen, we're out of time for today because I know you have another conversation coming up in just 5 minutes. So what I want to do is thank you very much for this conversation. We're going to pick it up next time and look at some of the general lessons that you've learned from all these different experiences. Might be valuable to other people that want to get involved in this type of work. So what I recommend is, first off, people want to learn about your work in journalism. Again, there'll be a link in the description of this video to that documentary that's available on Amazon. If they want to read about that.
There's also dondevereux.com if they want to get to my website.
Right. I'll put a link to your website, dondevereux.com, that people can also use to get that information. And we will just pick up this conversation next time. And so thank you very much.
My pleasure entirely. Good to see you.